If you can start that $500 dragster, it's yours, Marla Vance said into the auction microphone. Then she laughed, and nearly 200 people in the old race shop laughed with her. Daniel Mercer did not look at the crowd. He leaned over the narrow cockpit of the faded red machine, reached behind the cracked aluminum seat, and found the small steel lever the catalog inspectors had missed. It was a mechanical fuel shutoff, mounted backward and hidden under a strip of black tape. 6 inches above it sat an old magneto switch with no label. Neither part belonged on a fiberglass display replica. Daniel looked up at the auction clock. It was 10:18 on a Saturday morning. Vance Motorsports had until noon to clear the building for its new owner. And Marla had just made her challenge during a live company broadcast. Daniel's 13-year-old son, Eli, stood beside him holding the bidder card they had used to buy the car for $500. "I can tell you why it won't start," Daniel said, "but I won't light an unknown fuel system in a crowded building." The laughter thinned. Marla lowered the microphone. She was 46, precise, and tired from 3 months of closing divisions her board no longer wanted. "Then I guess it doesn't run." "That isn't what you said." Daniel pointed to the auctioneer's clerk. "Put the challenge on the paid invoice. Car as displayed, complete engine and driveline. $500 if it starts after a documented safety inspection. If it doesn't, I'll return it Monday." The auctioneer, a broad man named Lowell Crane, looked at Marla. She had built the moment to entertain bidders, while a forklift crew waited to haul the dragster into a scrap container. Refusing now would look worse than agreeing. She gave a short nod. Lowell wrote the condition in blue ink beneath the lot description. Marla initialed it. Daniel signed. At 10:21, Eli handed over the $500 they had saved for a used milling machine vise, and Lowell stamped the invoice paid. Daniel folded the paper once and placed it inside the metal case where he kept inspection certificates. Only then did he examine the car again. The body was long and narrow, with 2 missing aluminum panels and red paint burned almost pink along the cowl. The rear slicks were cracked beyond use. The front bicycle tires were flat. Dust filled the injector stacks, and a yellow tag wired to the steering arm called the machine a late 60s exhibition replica, non-operational. But replicas did not carry hand-filed weld toes at every chassis junction. They did not have a magnesium rear housing with cooling ribs used for only a few seasons before the rules changed. They did not route a fuel line beneath the left frame rail where a driver could reach the shutoff without taking his hand from the brake. Daniel put his palm against the roll hoop. Under the red paint, he could feel a shallow ridge where the tube had once been repaired. "Dad?" Eli asked. Daniel kept his voice low. "We bought more than a decoration." That was the moment the decision became expensive. Daniel was 57 and owned Mercer Machine and Brake in Oildale, California, a 2-bay shop that repaired fleet trucks, agricultural equipment, and the occasional race engine when an old customer still trusted him with one. He had raised Eli alone since the boy's mother died 6 years earlier. Business was steady, but steady was not the same as secure. The shop roof needed work. Their property tax installment was due in 12 days. $500 would not ruin them, but the time hidden inside the dragster might. Marla watched him photograph the invoice, the engine, the fuel system, and every side of the chassis. "You're taking this awfully seriously. You put your name on it. It's a prop, Mr. Mercer. My father bought it with a group of restaurant displays in 1998. Then Monday will settle it." Daniel called Nolan Price, a retired fire system inspector who had worked starting lines for 30 years. He asked Nolan to meet him at the shop and witness a non-running inspection. He also asked Lowell to include the dragster in the auction's loading video, from the time it left the lot until Daniel's trailer gate closed. Lowell agreed, because the request protected the auction house as much as it protected Daniel. By 11, Daniel and Eli had replaced the cracked rear tires with transport wheels borrowed from another lot. They winched the car onto Daniel's open trailer without turning the engine. Marla stood near the office doors while a company media assistant filmed the loading. "Don't replace the motor and tell people it came that way," she said. Daniel stopped the winch. "Your videographer just recorded the block number, the magneto, the injector body, and both frame rails. Lowell is sending copies to both of us." For the first time that morning, Marla did not have an immediate answer. At the shop, Nolan made them push the dragster into the clean bay and leave the doors open. He disconnected the magneto, grounded the ignition, drained 3 gallons of varnished fuel, and pressure tested the lines with inert gas. Daniel removed the spark plugs and turned the engine by hand. It moved through a full cycle without binding. Oil came from the sump dark but free of metal. Eli worked from a folding chair with a clipboard. He wrote the date, the time, every seal they broke, and the name of each witness. Daniel had taught him that a record made after trouble started was an argument. A record made before trouble started was evidence. Under the seat, they found 2 more details. The shutoff lever had been wrapped not to hide it from buyers, but to keep it from catching a driver's suit. Beside it, pressed into the inner aluminum panel, were 3 tiny holes arranged like a crooked triangle. Something had once been riveted there and removed. Nolan shone his light along the left chassis rail. That repair on the hoop bother you? It interests me. Difference? A bad repair tells you who to blame. A good repair tells you where to look. Daniel used solvent on a cotton swab, clearing only enough paint to see the weld. A narrow nickel bead ran around the tube. At the lower edge, the welder had stopped, backed up half an inch, and finished with a second pass. Daniel had seen that habit once before in photographs of an old dragster called the Resolute. The Resolute had won the 1969 National Fuel Championship after a season in which it seemed to leave the line without lifting its front wheels more than a few inches. Its driver, Cal Rourke, received most of the attention. The crew chief, Amos Bell, built the chassis setup and guarded it closely. The car disappeared after a warehouse fire in 1974. Racing magazines reported that the frame had warped and been cut up. No confirmed piece of it had surfaced in more than 50 years. Daniel did not say the name aloud. One weld was not proof. They spent Saturday afternoon removing nesting debris from the injector stacks, inspecting the valve train through the covers, and checking compression with the ignition disabled. 2 cylinders were weak but even enough to test. The blower turned freely. The magneto produced no spark because a fiber insulator inside the switch had split. At 6, Eli sat on the workbench eating a sandwich. He looked at the dragster and then at the empty place where the milling vise would have gone. Did we waste the money? Not yet. What if it is just a replica? Daniel tightened the cap on a sample bottle. Then we return it Monday and buy the vise next month. You want it to be that championship car. Daniel wiped his hands. Wanting is how people skip measurements. Eli nodded and entered the oil sample number on the sheet. Sunday morning, Nolan returned with a portable fire bottle and 2 new fuel hoses rated for alcohol. Daniel did not replace the old routed lines. He capped them and ran temporary test lines beside them, so the original layout remained untouched. He rebuilt the magneto switch on the bench, preserving the broken insulator in a labeled bag. He installed fresh plugs and primed the oil system through an external pump until pressure held at 42 pounds. At 9:40, a truck pulled into the alley. Marla stepped out with her general counsel, Thomas Greer, and a company mechanic named Pete Salazar. Pete carried a camera and an engine number sheet. "We're here to observe," Thomas said. Daniel checked the invoice. It gave Vance Motorsports the right to witness Monday's start test, not Sunday's preparation. He could have turned them away. Instead, he made them sign the inspection log and required Pete to record each existing number before touching the car. Pete had spent 20 years around modern road racing cars. He was not Daniel's enemy. Once he saw the fuel shut-off and magnesium rear housing, his professional interest overrode his employer's impatience. "This isn't restaurant hardware," Pete said. Marla folded her arms. "My father's inventory called it a replica. Your father's inventory called 3 Lola tubs decorative frames too. We corrected those last month." Thomas gave Pete a look that ended the conversation. Daniel showed them the temporary fuel lines, the compression readings, and the oil pressure test. He explained that the engine would run for no more than 12 seconds on a measured amount of fuel. No one would sit in the cockpit. Nolan would control the fire bottle, Daniel would operate the magneto from a remote lead, and Pete could watch every connection. Marla looked at the machine differently now. "If this starts, the engine remains company property." Daniel took out the invoice. "Complete engine and driveline, as displayed." The auction catalog separated decorative shells from power units. Lot 47 didn't. Thomas read the handwritten condition and the printed lot description. His expression remained neutral, but he stopped arguing. "We'll reserve our position." After they left, Eli asked what that meant. It means they know the paper is bad for them. Monday at 9, Lowell arrived with 2 cameras and the original auction file. Nolan placed extinguishers at the front and rear. Pete returned for Vance Motorsports. Marla did not. Daniel rolled the dragster outside, chalked all 4 wheels, and connected a small fuel cell containing enough methanol for the test. He verified the shutoff was closed. He spun the engine with the starter until oil pressure reached 40 pounds. Then he opened the hidden lever, armed the magneto, and pressed the starter again. The engine fired on the second revolution. It did not sound like a restored show car. It sounded hard and uneven, 8 cylinders waking through mechanical injection after decades of silence. The shop windows vibrated. Dust fell from a rafter. Eli took 1 step backward, then caught himself, and stared at the exhaust headers as pale flame flickered at their ends. At 11 seconds, Daniel cut the magneto. The engine stopped cleanly. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Nolan checked the fuel shutoff, and then the temperature gun. Pete walked around the car with both hands on his hips. "Send Marla the whole video," Daniel told Lowell. "Uncut." Pete crouched beside the rear housing. His thumb traced a small diagonal file mark beneath the filler plug. "I've seen that mark." "Where?" Pete stood. "An archive print in Mr. Vance's office. His father collected old racing photographs. There's a close shot of Amos Bell servicing the Resolute rear end. Same diagonal nick." Daniel felt the name settle into the bay. He still did not call it proof. By noon, a 38-second clip from Lowell's second camera had been posted by a bidder who filmed from the alley. The video showed the faded dragster firing, Eli's stunned face, and Pete bending toward the rear housing. It reached local racing forums before Vance Motorsports issued a statement calling the car an assembled exhibition object of undetermined origin. At 1:17, Thomas Greer emailed a notice demanding that Daniel preserve the engine, magneto, chassis, and rear assembly, and make them available for company retrieval. The notice claimed the engine had been inadvertently included in the visual staging and was not conveyed. Daniel forwarded the email to Ruth Calder, a 63-year-old commercial attorney whose pickup he had kept running for 15 years. Ruth read the invoice, the catalog, the loading video record, and Thomas's preservation notice. "Don't move the car," she said. "Don't dismantle anything that isn't required for conservation. Don't answer them alone. Do they have a case? They have a reason to make one. Their board is selling assets to satisfy a lender covenant by the end of the month. If this is what you think it is, they'll say the sale involved a mutual mistake. It wasn't mutual. That matters. So does the fact that you suspected value before the engine ran." Daniel told her exactly what he had noticed, and when. Ruth's first accurate criticism landed where it should. He had known the dragster was not an ordinary replica when he paid. He had not known its identity, but a company lawyer could describe his silence as sharp dealing. "You didn't owe them your expertise before the sale," Ruth said. "But from now on, you owe the facts daylight." Daniel agreed to place the dragster under a neutral storage seal at the shop. Nolan and Lowell signed the inventory. Pete signed it too, after Thomas authorized him to witness. That evening, Daniel found Eli at the kitchen table replaying the start video without sound. The boy had school papers spread around the phone but was not reading them. "They're going to take it, aren't they? They're going to try. Because it's worth something now." Daniel opened the property tax envelope and looked at the total. He could solve the immediate problem by accepting a buyback. He could also teach Eli that a written promise lasted only until the other party regretted it. "Tomorrow, we find out what we can prove," he said. The first proof did not come from an expert. It came from measurement. Daniel enlarged the best available photograph of the Resolute from a 1,970 race annual. He set scale using the known diameter of the rear wheel. The distance from the roll hoop to the rear axle matched within a quarter inch. The steering box mount had the same 3-hole pattern. The left fuel line crossed the frame at the same unusual angle. Eli noticed the missing plate under the seat. In a pit photograph, a small timing chart had been riveted exactly where the 3 holes remained. They sent a written evidence packet to the California Drag Racing Archive, not asking for authentication, only requesting access to its Resolute files. The archive director, Helen Ortiz, replied that the collection could host supervised research on Thursday. She also wrote that Amos Bell, the former crew chief, was alive, 81, and scheduled to attend a historic drag strip reunion 3 weeks later. She would not contact him until the physical evidence justified it. Daniel respected that. On Wednesday, Marla came to the shop without Thomas. She stood outside the sealed bay and looked through the glass at the dragster. "My board wants it returned." "Your board sold it." "My father cataloged it incorrectly. He died last year. I'm the one cleaning up what he left." That was the first time Daniel saw the pressure beneath her certainty. Vance Motorsports had once built winning teams. Under Marla, it had shifted into technology, licensing, and hospitality. A private lender had demanded asset sales after a failed expansion. She was not trying to steal a car for herself. She was trying to prevent one humiliating mistake from becoming evidence that she had mishandled the whole liquidation. "Thomas can offer you $180,000, she said. "You keep the 500 story. We take the car. No admission from either side." The offer was enough to repair Daniel's roof, pay Eli's future tuition, clear the tax bill, and leave money in reserve. It was also offered before authentication. Marla was pricing his uncertainty. "Will you preserve it?" he asked. "We'll have professionals restore it. Will you keep the chassis, engine, and rear housing together until the evidence is finished?" "I won't bind the company before we know what each component is worth." Daniel shook his head. "Then no." Marla looked at the stained ceiling above him. "You're risking a great deal for a machine you haven't proved." "So are you." He gave her a second choice. They could jointly appoint the archive, seal the components, share testing costs, and agree that whichever party prevailed would preserve the car intact. Vance Motorsports would receive credit for correcting its catalog and helping recover a historic vehicle. Marla had her chance to correct course. She said the board would never accept conditions written by a brake shop owner. "Then let Ruth send them," Daniel said. Marla left without answering. At the archive on Thursday, Helen Ortiz placed 6 boxes on a steel table. Daniel and Eli wore cotton gloves and worked under a fixed camera. The records included race programs, timing sheets, photographs, and correspondence from the Resolute team. The famous images showed the whole car. The useful images showed hands. In one, Amos Bell knelt beside the rear housing with a file on the ground. The filler plug had the diagonal mark Pete remembered. In another, a fuel line curved beneath the left rail, secured by 3 hand-cut clamps. A third showed the repaired roll hoop after a 1970 towing accident. The nickel beads stopped, backed up, and finished exactly as Daniel had observed. Then Eli found a contact sheet from the week before the 1969 championship. One frame showed the inner cockpit without a driver. Beneath the seat, the timing chart had been removed. On the aluminum panel behind it, 3 empty holes formed a crooked triangle. Helen did not declare the car authentic. She created certified scans and asked Daniel to provide a full-dimensional survey. She also found a 1,974 insurance file that complicated the story. The warehouse fire had damaged the Resolute's body and front axle, but an adjuster wrote that the primary frame and power assembly were removed before demolition. The public report saying the car had been destroyed was based on the building owner's statement, not a disposal receipt. Someone had saved it. The higher-stakes question was no longer whether Daniel had found an old race chassis. It was who removed it, who owned it afterward, and how it entered the Vance collection. While Daniel and Eli were driving home, Marla sat at the head of a conference table in the administration building the company would vacate at the end of the month. Thomas had printed still images from the start video and placed them beside the liquidation report. 4 board members joined by video. A representative from the lender listened without turning on his camera. Marla explained the catalog history, the challenge, and the handwritten invoice. She did not soften her own role. Her father's old inventory had carried the dragster at $6,000 as decorative equipment. The liquidation team spent less than 4 minutes reviewing it because the car had no modern title, no current logbook, and no separate engine record. A specialized inspection would have cost more than the expected sale price. One director asked why Daniel had recognized components the company's own staff missed. Pete answered that the company had assigned him to current race assets, not warehouse displays. The omission was efficient when the object was worth $500 and reckless if it was worth 7 figures. Both statements were true. Thomas gave the board its strongest argument. Daniel had noticed unusual hardware before he signed. A court might decide that both parties were mistaken about identity, even if only one party was mistaken about value. but the company had described the car as complete, allowed inspection, rejected a higher pre-auction appraisal budget, and let its chief executive add a start condition in writing. Litigation would expose all of that. Then buy it back, the lender representative said. Marla thought of the number Daniel had refused, and the preservation condition he had proposed. He isn't bargaining over price. Everyone is bargaining over price. Marla knew that sentence had guided much of her career. It had also guided the morning of the auction. She authorized Thomas to increase the offer and to preserve the company's legal position. She did not authorize him to accuse Daniel of changing the engine. That allegation appeared in his next draft because it created leverage. Thomas sent it after receiving approval from the board's restructuring committee, not from Marla personally. When she read the final letter, she could have withdrawn it. She let it stand. Ruth traced the chain through paper. The original team sold damaged equipment in 1975 to a fabricator named Leon Baird. Baird's widow sold his shop contents in 1998 to Howard Vance, Marla's father. The bill of sale listed one incomplete long-frame exhibition car with engine. Howard had paid $6,000 for the group. No theft report, lien, or retained title appeared anywhere in the chain. Vance Motorsports had owned the dragster lawfully. Then it had lawfully sold it to Daniel. Thomas changed tactics. His next letter accused Daniel of replacing the engine after the auction. The claim relied on a gap of 90 minutes between the dragster leaving the corporate camera's view and reaching Daniel's shop. Lowell's loading video closed most of that gap. A gas station security camera closed another 12 minutes. Daniel's own alley camera showed the trailer arriving, the dragster still strapped in place, and Nolan entering 6 minutes later. The block number visible in all three recordings matched Pete's inspection. Then the company removed its official auction video from the web. Eli discovered the missing page while trying to show a classmate the challenge. Daniel did not let him turn the deletion into an accusation. Instead, they downloaded the public event page through an independent web archive and preserved the bidder's recording. Lowell produced the master video under a records request from Ruth. The footage showed Marla's challenge, her initials on the condition, and a close view of the engine before Daniel touched it. A local television producer offered Daniel a live interview under the headline, "Mechanic Beats Millionaire at Her Own Game." The producer wanted him to start the dragster again in the parking lot and hold the invoice for the camera. The appearance would have brought customers to the shop at the moment he needed them. Daniel declined. The fuel system was under seal, authentication was incomplete, and turning Marla into a cartoon would make every later fact look like part of a performance. Eli disagreed. They already made you look like you cheated. That's why we don't give them a second argument. People will believe their statement. Some will. The answer frustrated the boy. He went outside and kicked a transport tire hard enough to hurt his foot. Daniel let him take 3 steps toward the alley before calling him back. Being right doesn't mean we get to be careless, Daniel said. It means we have less excuse to be. Eli looked toward the sealed bay. Mom would have gone on television. Daniel almost smiled. Laura Mercer had worked as a county records clerk and believed any meeting could be improved by a labeled binder. She also had more courage in public than Daniel did. The boy was right about her. She would have brought copies, Daniel said. They spent that night making them. One binder held title records. One held images and measurements. One held the safety log, video chronology, and parts bags. Eli created an index and added a blank column for objections. If the company raised one, they would record it and answer with evidence rather than anger. Daniel watched him work and understood that the conflict had already changed his son. Eli was no longer only protecting a car. He was learning how a working man protected his own credibility when a larger institution could afford more words. Ruth sent the evidence to Thomas with a proposed standstill agreement. The company could inspect, photograph, and attend authentication. In return, it would stop claiming substitution until a neutral examiner reported. Thomas accepted. The agreement cost Daniel something immediately. Vance Motorsports owned a fleet services subsidiary that accounted for almost a quarter of his shop's monthly work. 2 days after the standstill, the fleet manager told him the renewal would be reviewed elsewhere. No threat was written. None was needed. Daniel had 3 mechanics depending on him. He could not treat the loss as a personal badge of honor. He spent Friday calling agricultural customers and municipal contractors, asking for work he normally did not have time to chase. He took an overnight brake job on 6 produce trucks. Eli slept on a cot in the office, while Daniel and his crew worked until dawn. The canceled fleet work also exposed an error Daniel had been avoiding for years. One customer controlled too much of the shop's schedule. Laura had warned him about it when she was alive. Daniel had answered that a dependable contract was safer than chasing 20 smaller accounts. After she died, he kept the contract partly because changing anything felt like admitting the old life was gone. Now the safest account had become the easiest lever against him. At a Monday staff meeting, Daniel told his mechanics the exact numbers. He could cover payroll for 5 weeks without new work. The equipment loan would extend that to 9, but only if the shop kept its municipal certification. He offered each man the option to leave with a full reference, rather than wait through the dispute. Ben Torres, who had worked beside Daniel for 11 years, asked one question. "Did you swap that engine?" "No." "Then stop offering us the door and show us the truck list." The other 2 men nodded. They divided the calls, maintenance schedules, and night work. Daniel did not mistake loyalty for free labor. He wrote overtime into the ledger even when the cash to pay it had not arrived. If the dragster eventually produced money, the debt to his crew would be paid before he treated any of it as gain. At 7, Daniel found the boy awake, entering invoice numbers into a spreadsheet. "You shouldn't be here all night." "Neither should you." Daniel almost told him that adults carried certain burdens so children would not have to. The sentence would have been false. Eli had already carried the uncertainty home. "You're right," Daniel said. "We finish these 2, then we both sleep." The neutral inspection occurred the following Tuesday. Helen appointed Dr. Malcolm Reed, a metallurgist who had examined historic race frames for museums and insurers. Vance Motorsports sent Pete and Thomas. Daniel brought Nolan and Ruth. Malcolm began with the chassis. Portable alloy testing dated the main tubes to batches consistent with late 60s aircraft-grade steel. Radiography showed the roll hoop repair beneath later paint, with no sign of recent alteration. Tool marks on the rear housing carried embedded oxidation that could not have been created during Daniel's ownership. The engine block casting date preceded the 1969 season, and internal inspection through a bore scope showed period machining rather than a modern replica. He also took microscopic paint samples from places selected by both parties. The red topcoat covered a darker maroon layer, then gray primer, then bare metal. Archive color transparencies of the Resolute showed the same darker maroon during its first season and the brighter red after a sponsor change. In the protected space beneath the missing timing chart, both colors remained in clean sequence. Thomas asked whether a skilled fabricator could reproduce that layering. "Yes," Malcolm said. "Given the original pigments, the original metal, knowledge of the exact hidden location, and several decades in which to age it. So it's possible." Possible isn't the same as supported. Malcolm showed them corrosion that had grown through the primer boundary and beneath the rivet holes. Reproducing it in the 3 days Daniel possessed the car would require changing the measurable chemistry of time. Pete checked the steering mount against Helen's certified dimensions. 2 bolt holes were slightly oval, not from damage but from repeated removal. In a 1971 maintenance note, Amos had complained that the steering box had to be pulled after every 3rd event because a bushing walked under vibration. The wear pattern matched that routine. Each small match reduced the room for coincidence. None depended on Daniel's reputation. That mattered to him more than praise from people who had not known his name a month earlier. One number did not match the Resolute's published engine number. Thomas seized on it. "Then it isn't the championship engine." Daniel had expected the objection. In a timing sheet from the archive, the Resolute's crew recorded an engine failure 2 races before the championship and installed B motor, unnumbered spare. The published number belonged to the failed unit. The block in Daniel's shop had a faint B stamped beneath the magneto base. Malcolm photographed it. Helen located the original timing sheet and certified its date. The counterclaim had produced the second verification. Still, Malcolm would not sign a final report without Amos Bell. "Welds and marks establish continuity," he said. "They don't establish who made the decisions. If Bell remembers the repair and fuel layout independently, that matters." The historic reunion at Valley Heritage Drag Strip agreed to provide a controlled authentication bay. Amos would be interviewed before seeing the car or any recent photographs. Helen prepared a blind set of images containing the Resolute and 4 similar dragsters. Daniel agreed not to speak with Amos until the interview was complete. 2 days before the reunion, Amos's daughter called Helen and said her father was considering staying home. He had spent 50 years answering questions about the driver, the championship, and the fire. Most people wanted a photograph and a dramatic sentence. Few asked about the men who set valve lash at midnight or drove the tow rig home after losing. Helen did not ask Daniel to persuade him. She sent Amos copies of Eli's inspection sheets with the boy's name covered. Every component had a line, a condition, and a witness. The rear housing file mark received no more space than a cracked clamp. That plain record convinced Amos the event was an authentication, not a show. He agreed to come on one condition. If the car was real, the museum record would name the whole crew. Daniel accepted before he knew whether a museum would make an offer. Thomas objected that Daniel could not promise display language for an object still under dispute. "I can promise what I'll require if I own it," Daniel said. That condition traveled back to Marla. Her father's archive credited drivers, sponsors, executives, and car numbers. Mechanics appeared mostly as unidentified men in the background. For the first time, she understood that Daniel's refusal to sell parts was connected to something larger than value. Separating the engine would repeat what the old photographs had already done: keep the famous result and remove the hands that made it possible. Marla's board had 21 days left on its lender covenant. The reunion fell on day 19. Thomas offered a settlement of $325,000. This time, the company would preserve the frame but reserve the right to sell the engine separately. Daniel declined in writing. Ruth made sure his answer explained why. The car's history depended on the relationship among its parts. The decision forced Daniel to borrow against shop equipment to make payroll. He signed the note at the same desk where he kept the $500 invoice. His hand paused above the signature line. "You can still take their offer," Ruth said. "If Malcolm says it isn't the Resolute, I return it under the challenge. The contract doesn't require that. My word does." That was Daniel's midpoint choice. He would not use a technicality to keep a valuable object if the premise failed, and he would not sell pieces of a history he had not created. Either boundary could cost him the shop. The morning of the reunion, the dragster traveled in a sealed, enclosed trailer provided by the archive. Daniel followed in his pickup with Eli. They spoke little. The boy held the metal document case on his lap. At the strip, hundreds of older racers, families, and collectors moved among restored cars under the grandstand. The authentication bay stood behind a rope line, visible to the public but controlled by archive staff. Cameras from the event recorded continuously. Amos Bell arrived in a wheelchair pushed by his daughter. He was 81, thin through the shoulders, with hands enlarged by arthritis. Helen interviewed him in a room away from the car. From the blind photographs, Amos identified the Resolute by the spacing of the front uprights and a small notch in the cowl. He described the 1,970 roll hoop repair before anyone mentioned it. "Leon Baird welded it," he said. "He always stopped short, backed up, and covered his own ending." He drew the fuel line route on blank paper. The line passed beneath the left rail and rose behind the seat to a backward-mounted shutoff. He explained that Cal Rourke had short fingers and could not reach the standard lever while strapped in. Finally, Helen asked about the rear housing. Amos smiled without pleasure. "I put a file mark below the plug because we had 2 housings. That one ran 3 degrees cooler. In bad light, the slash told me which was which." Only then did they bring him into the bay. The faded dragster sat under white inspection lights, still missing its panels, still wearing transport wheels. Daniel had refused to polish it. Amos stopped 10 feet away. His daughter locked the wheelchair brakes. He looked first at the cowl, then the left rail, then the rear housing. He did not touch anything until Helen gave permission. His fingers found the diagonal mark. Then they moved to the nickel repair on the hoop. "Leon complained I made him fix a bend no one else could see," Amos said. "He was right about the bend. I was right about fixing it." The crowd behind the rope remained quiet enough to hear the archive camera's cooling fan. Marla and Thomas stood at the far end of the bay. Marla had come because her board's special counsel required it. Pete stood beside them. Helen presented the evidence in simple order. The 1,975 transfer to Leon Baird, the 1,998 sale to Howard Vance, the auction invoice, the continuous engine record, the metallurgical report, the archive photographs, and Amos's blind identification. Malcolm signed the authentication report as Helen finished. The report identified the machine as the surviving Resolute chassis, Championship B engine, magneto, and rear assembly. It estimated that a conservative museum-quality conservation could produce an insured value between $1 and $4 million. The number was not a cash payment. It was a valuation supported by comparable historic competition cars, intact major components, and an unusually complete chain of evidence. Thomas stepped forward with the company's final objection. He argued that Marla lacked authority to amend auction terms orally, and that her challenge had been entertainment. Lowell opened the original auction contract. As corporate chief executive and named liquidation officer, Marla had authority to approve lot adjustments under Section 7. Her initials appeared beside the handwritten condition. The board's own minutes named her as the executive responsible for disposal. Ruth did not make a speech. She handed the page to the board's special counsel. The consequence happened there, in the bay. Special counsel announced that Vance Motorsports would release every claim to the dragster, withdraw the substitution allegation, and correct its public statement. The board had determined that continued litigation would violate the standstill evidence and risk the lender process. It would also restore Daniel's fleet service contract, or compensate his shop for the canceled term. Marla looked at Daniel across the car. She had one final choice between protecting her pride and correcting the record herself. She asked for the microphone. "I called this machine a replica," she said. "I was wrong. Mr. Mercer preserved the evidence when my company did not, and he honored a safety condition I treated as a joke. Vance Motorsports sold the complete car. We will honor the sale." There was applause from the grandstand side, but Daniel barely heard it. Amos had asked Eli to reach behind the seat and show him the fuel shutoff. The old crew chief watched the boy's hand find the backward lever. "That's where Cal reached," Amos said. The reunion allowed one controlled engine start after Nolan, Malcolm, and the track safety chief completed a second inspection. They fitted fresh rear tires and rolled the car to a static start pad. Amos sat behind the barrier with hearing protection over his gray hair. Marla remained near the archive tent. Daniel primed the system. Eli read the checklist. At the final line, Daniel opened the hidden shutoff and armed the magneto. The engine caught. This time it ran 20 seconds, clean enough for the idle to settle into the hard rhythm preserved on old film. Amos closed his eyes. Pete watched the exhaust temperature readings. Eli held the clipboard against his chest, as if the sound had weight. Daniel shut it down at the planned mark. No one mistook the start for the proof. The proof was already signed, measured, and witnessed. The sound was something else. It was the part of history that paper could not carry by itself. In the weeks that followed, 3 private collectors contacted Daniel. The highest proposed purchase was $9 million, conditioned on a cosmetic restoration and the right to install a modern engine for exhibition runs. Daniel declined. The California Museum of Competition offered a different arrangement. It would acquire the dragster for $2 million, keep every authenticated major component together, conserve rather than over-restore the surfaces, and hire Daniel as paid restoration supervisor for an 18-month project. Amos and the families of the original crew would be interviewed for the permanent record. Eli's inspection log would be included in the acquisition file. Daniel accepted after adding one condition. The display label would name the mechanics, fabricators, and crew before listing the championship statistics. The money cleared the shop loan, repaired the roof, funded Eli's education account, and allowed Daniel to offer his 3 mechanics a profit-sharing plan. He did not buy a larger house. He replaced the worn milling vise they had postponed at the auction. The first job held in that vise was not a museum part. It was a cracked bracket from a county water truck. Daniel set it square while Eli swept chips from the mill. The ordinary repair paid less than 1 hour of museum consulting, but it returned the shop to its proper scale. History had entered the building, demanded attention, and left behind better tools. It had not made daily work unimportant. Ben logged the bracket, Curtis prepared the replacement stock, and May called the county with a completion time. By noon, the truck was back in service. Marla kept her position through the liquidation, but the board changed its asset review policy. No historic vehicle could be sold without a physical inspection by 2 qualified people, one of whom had no reporting line to the disposal executive. Pete was placed in charge of the review. The company also paid the shop for the fleet work it had pulled. Marla came to Mercer Machine and Brake once, 6 months later. She did not bring lawyers. She brought the original photograph from her father's office, the one showing Amos at the rear housing. "This belongs with the file," she said. Daniel examined it. On the back, Howard Vance had written a date and 1 sentence, "Bought from Leon." Probably more than display. Marla had found the note while clearing his desk. It was evidence that her father had doubted his own catalog, but never followed the doubt. "Why didn't he tell anyone?" Eli asked. Marla took a moment before answering. He thought there would always be more time. Daniel placed the photograph in an archival sleeve. He did not use it to reopen the argument. The car was already safe. The museum unveiled the conserved Resolute the following spring. The red paint remained faded. 1 missing side panel stayed missing, because no reliable photograph showed what had been on it after the fire. The nickel repair remained visible. The diagonal file mark was lit by a small lamp beneath the rear housing. Amos could not attend, but his recorded voice explained why the fuel shutoff sat backward. Pete stood with his family. Marla came without a reserved seat. Daniel's mechanics wore clean work shirts and looked uncomfortable near the donors until Eli showed them where their names appeared in the conservation credits. Near closing time, after most visitors had left, Eli stood beside the cockpit. He was taller than he had been at the auction. The museum had mounted the original $500 invoice in a case, blue initials and all. "Why did she give it away if it mattered that much?" he asked. Daniel looked through the glass at the lever behind the seat. "Because she only believed it mattered after someone else made it breathe again." Eli considered that, then shook his head. "It mattered before." "Yes," Daniel said. "That's why the paperwork mattered too." Before they left, the curator allowed Daniel to perform the final preservation check. He reached into the cockpit, pulled the hidden shutoff closed, and tied a new black safety ribbon through the lever. Eli entered the date in the museum log. The dragster sat under warm light with its faded paint, repaired hoop, and scarred rear housing unchanged. Nothing about it looked new. That was the point. On the other side of the glass, the old milling vise from Daniel's shop held a small display card explaining how 1 delayed purchase had helped save a national champion. Visitors stopped longest at the marks no restorer had erased, because those marks proved who had been there. Eli noticed that children usually found the hidden lever before adults did. They looked where a driver's hand would reach, not where a plaque told them to look. Daniel switched off his inspection lamp. The red body went dark first. The diagonal file mark held the light for 1 second longer, then disappeared with everything else.